Everyone, welcome to our webinar on the subject of the Sustainable Development Goals, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and children's participation. Firstly, as is customary, I'd like to acknowledge that we're beaming to you today on the lands of the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and welcome all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are attending today. My name is Matthew Keeley. I'm the Director of Youth Law Australia, and we are one of the project partners in this webinar series, along with the Diplomacy Training Program, Australian Lawyers for Human Rights, the University of New South Wales, and a number of very fine academic supporters, specifically Noam Peleg, Faith Gordon, and Georgina Demopoulos, amongst others. As mentioned, this is one of our webinar series, and in fact, the 20th and the penultimate this year on the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the concluding observations of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child in response to Australia's 5th and 6th reports. The webinars were initially organised by us, the project partners, as a COVID time substitute to our ordinary and face-to-face training programs, which are based around the treaty body reporting process. Those are two-day programs generally, and face-to-face, and of course were paused during COVID. The webinars are aimed at building the capacity of federal and state authorities, service providers, civil society organisations and children themselves to understand and participate meaningfully in the implementation of the Convention. A little bit of housekeeping before we move on to introduce our two marvellous speakers today. Firstly, if I could ask everyone just to pay attention to muting their audio, that'd be great, just to eliminate background noise. Secondly, questions and comments will be addressed following both speakers' presentations. If you could please, if possible, put your questions or comments in the chat, and we'll be attending to those that appear first in time in the chat, first in time. But of course, after both speakers are presented, there's also an opportunity to put your hand up directly as well. But it would be great to help out, if you can, to please place your questions and comments in the chat for us. Please also pay attention to the chat, because Rataba works incredibly hard to make sure that documents referenced by our presenters are linked in the chat, and so it becomes a wonderful repository of some amazing resources that you may not get access to so easily otherwise. So do please pay attention to what's going on in the chat. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Dr. Holly Doel-Mackaway. Holly is a legal academic at the Macquarie Law School in Sydney. Her 2022 book, Indigenous Children's Right to Participate in Law and Policy Development, presents a model for reforming and developing Indigenous-related legislation and policy in Australia and internationally. It provides guidance about how to seek, listen to, and respond to the voices of Indigenous children and young people in line with the Convention. Holly has worked as a children's rights lawyer across 20 countries in the Asia Pacific for UNICEF, Save the Children, Law Asia, and various other international non-government organisations. I'm looking very much forward to hearing Holly talk about that model, and I introduce to you now Dr. Holly Doel-Mackaway. Thanks, Holly.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for that kind introduction. I will share my screen now and show you some slides to hopefully assist in this presentation. Hopefully you can see those slides. Thank you also to the Diplomacy Training Program and to Youth Law Australia and the Australian Lawyers for Human Rights for inviting me to talk today. I'm Holly Doel-Mackaway, and I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the beautiful lands that I live and that I work on, the Wallumattagal clan of the Darug Nation. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and I thank the Wallumattagal peoples for caring for country and for nurturing and teaching children on this land since the dream time. I recognise Aboriginal sovereignty over this land, that this land was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So today I'll be talking about children's rights and the SDGs in Australia, and I'll be examining what the Committee on the Rights of the Child has asked Australia to do with respect to implementing the SDGs in their concluding comments on the measures taken to implement the CRC. Included in this, and at the end of this presentation, I'll draw out what the committee has said about the realisation of Indigenous children's rights, and I'll present a model that I have developed with Indigenous children for Indigenous children's participation in law and policy making. The Sustainable Development Goals are a universal call to action to end poverty, to reduce inequality, to protect the planet, to build more peaceful, prosperous societies, and to improve the lives and prospects of everyone, everywhere. The 17 goals were adopted by all UN member states in 2015, and this was part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which sets out a 15-year plan to achieve these goals. UNICEF says the SDGs cannot be achieved without the realisation of child rights. And in 2019, which was 30 years since the adoption of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, more than 100 member states renewed their commitment to children's rights in the context of implementing the SDGs via a global pledge. And this pledge was called For Every Child, Every Right. And today progress is being made in places, but overall action to meet the goals is not yet advancing at the speed or the scale required. And this includes in Australia. The global pledge that I've just referred to acknowledges the interconnectedness of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And it notes the convention highlights the timeless and indispensable international standards for ensuring the realisation of the rights of every child, whereas the SDGs articulate a contemporary vision for sustainable social, economic and environmental progress that can be achieved when all people, including children, work together for a peaceful, prosperous and secure future. And I will place in the chat or give to Claire the references to all of these statements that you can look up in at another time. So pictured here is the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. And this is the body of 18 experts who are responsible for monitoring state party compliance and implementation of the CRC. In 2009, the committee made it clear with their general comment number 12, and this was called the right of the child to be heard, that, and in quotes, children should be consulted in the formulation of legislation and policy and involved in the drafting, development and implementation of related plans and programs. The committee have reiterated and reaffirmed the centrality of children's participation in matters affecting them and of the importance of Article 12 of the Convention on so many occasions, including in their comments on Australia's 5th and 6th reports on the implementation of the Convention, which I'll turn to now. In their concluding observations on Australia in 2019, the committee repeatedly mentions Australia's responsibilities in relation to the SDGs. Significantly, and mirroring the committee's general comment number 12, in the first mention about the SDGs, the committee stressed the interconnection between the realisation of children's rights in accordance with the Convention on the Rights of the Child to implementing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Now, this is important because it demonstrates the committee's guidance to Australia that children's participation in legal and policy matters affecting them is an overarching mandate, and it informs the implementation of the CRC and of the SDGs. As the extract from the concluding observations for Australia on the screen now depicts, the committee urged the Australian government to involve children in any policies and programs related to children that seek to achieve the SDGs. So as well as urging Australia to engage with children to implement the SDGs, the recommendations drew links to the SDGs in relation to children's rights to freedom from discrimination, children's civil rights and freedoms, children's rights to freedom from violence, ending harmful practices as they relate to children, children's mental health, the impacts of climate change on children's rights, and education, and that is free, equitable primary and secondary education. Now, notably, I want to stress that across all mentions of the SDGs, apart from in relation to harmful practices and climate change, the committee focused on the urgent need to realise the rights of Aboriginal children. And another theme that emerged from the committee's concluding observations in 2019 were that so many of the committee's previous recommendations contained in their 2012 concluding obs remained unactioned and unresourced. So I want to go now to what the committee said about these various elements, and I'll go to non-discrimination. In relation to children's rights to non-discrimination, a foundation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the committee noted the non-implementation of their 2012 recommendations. And the committee urged Australia to combat discrimination and address disparities in access to services in relation to Aboriginal children, in relation to children with disabilities, children in alternate care, and asylum-seeking refugee and migrant children. There is some good news. A significant report was released last year. It was called the Family Matters Report. Again, I will link that in the chat. And this report measured legislative and policy-based discrimination about the overrepresentation of Aboriginal children in out-of-home care in Australia. And it's yet to be known the outcomes in regards to the recommendations it contains. So thirdly, in relation to children's civil rights and freedoms, the committee noted, amongst other matters, that not all children, particularly Indigenous children living in remote areas, are registered at birth, and urged Australia to correct this. The fourth mention of the SDGs in the concluding observations is in relation to freedom from violence. And the committee set out an extensive list of measures to implement the SDGs and the convention in regards to children's rights to freedom from violence. And there was a list that the committee helpfully provided about what Australia needs to do to address this, particularly to address sexual violence against girls. And this includes recommendations to substantially increase family violence prevention, especially regarding Indigenous children. Again, in good news, Australia has since then taken some action on this recommendation by releasing the new National Framework for Protecting Australia's Children, which goes from 2021 to 2031. And importantly, that document stipulates that Aboriginal people's right to self-determine is at the forefront of that framework, and includes, again for the first time, specific action plans in relation to Aboriginal children. The fifth mention in relation to harmful practices is where the committee urged Australia to strengthen its measures to raise awareness about the harmful effects of child marriage and physical well-being and mental health of girls. And it urged Australia furthermore to enact legislation explicitly to prohibit coerced sterilisation or any unnecessary medical or surgical treatment. The committee made some very clear recommendations with regards to children's mental health, and it reiterated and noted the non-implementation of, again, its previous comments in 2012, that there has not been an investment in addressing the underlying causes of suicide and poor mental health among children. And there's a need to improve knowledge, awareness and services, particularly as this relates to vulnerable children. The seventh mention was in regards to climate change, and the committee called for urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts, particularly on children. What I think is of note is that the committee expressed their concern about Australia's position that the Convention on the Rights of the Child does not extend to protection from climate change. And the committee stated that the effects of climate change have an undeniable impact on children's rights. For example, the rights to life, survival and development, non-discrimination, health and an adequate standard of living. Australia's position on this, however, remains unchanged, and this is notable. There was some hope this year that that might change. However, the full federal court ruled this year on appealing Minister for the Environment and Sharma that the Commonwealth Minister for the Environment doesn't owe a duty of care to Australian children to protect them from the physical harms of climate change, which might arise in, for instance, granting environmental approvals for fossil fuel projects. The committee noted insufficient progress on the goals and targets set out in the Paris Agreement and called out the Australian government for their negative reaction and disrespect that they showed towards children who protested at climate rallies across the nation. And in doing so, the committee notes the government disrespected children's rights to express their views as provided for by the Convention on the Rights of the Child, particularly in Article 12, but across other articles too. Finally, in relation to education, the committee expressed concern about insufficient efforts to close the gap in educational opportunity for Aboriginal children and called on Australia to implement the SDGs to reach the targets on school attendance, retention rates, literacy and numeracy standards, but also paying particular attention to children living in remote areas and a particular need to invest in teachers' cultural competency in these communities. So the committee urged Australia to invest far more in improving education equity at all levels, particularly in regards to children living in remote areas and Aboriginal children. They also stressed the importance of improving educational outcomes for children with disabilities and children living in marginalised and disadvantaged circumstances, particularly those who are living in alternate care and children from refugee and migrant backgrounds. They also noted several areas where children's rights are being breached in educational contexts and called for urgent reform, including in relation to the use of restraints and seclusion with children with disabilities. They called for change around discrimination against girls. They called for change and action on bullying, particularly online bullying, in particular against lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex children. So that is a summary of what the committee said about the SDGs. I think it's worthy of note that we consider some of the comments made from the committee whilst considering the 5th and 6th reports for Australia. For example, Mr. Nelson from Samoa noted that Australia continues to not have a National Child Rights Act. He noted the committee has recommended this before and expressed a big question mark about why that hasn't occurred yet, because he says it would assist Australia to implement children's rights so fundamentally. He also noted critical child rights issues that remain unaddressed, and he said they all require urgent attention, including, as I've already mentioned, violence against children, care and protection issues, climate change, children with disabilities, Aboriginal children, and children in conflict with the law. He also noted that there is an extraordinary amount of children in pre-trial detention, and diversion doesn't receive a lot of attention in Australia, he said, and nor has Australia ratified the 3rd optional protocol to the convention. What I think is really important is that the Vice Chairperson urged Australia to raise the age of criminal responsibility. She said, the age of criminal responsibility is bewildering in Australia. I think that's a very powerful comment, and I agree. Another member of the committee noted there is something wrong with the child protection system in Australia, and it's getting worse. There are increased rates of removal of children into out-of-home care with overrepresentation of Aboriginal children. So the picture that I'm painting is not a very positive picture with regards to the implementation of the SDGs and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And indeed, like many other nations on earth, the implementation of children's rights in Australia remains underdeveloped. And as such, the realisation of children's rights in Australia is fragile and varied as it is globally. John Tobin questions the degree to which the convention is being used in Australia to shape legislation and policy, or whether the reference to the convention is tokenistic. He notes that aside from a few examples, there's been no real attempt to comprehensively import this international instrument into domestic law. There are some examples at the federal level, such as the establishment of the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights that considers the Convention on the Rights of the Child in relation to new legislation, and as well as national frameworks such as the Early Childhood Framework or the Child Protection Framework or the Standards for Out-of-Home Care. But other than that, as well as a few amendments to the Family Law Act, for instance, there is very little implementation of the Convention in Australia. To conclude, I would like to suggest a model for how to try to achieve meaningful participation of children, especially Aboriginal children, in the realisation of Australia's obligations to implement the CRC and the SDGs. This is a model developed in consultation with Aboriginal children and young people, but it's equally relevant to any consultation activity with children, and it's outlined in my recent book called Indigenous Children's Rights participate in law and policy development. The model consists of 5 key elements that I believe are necessary for the engagement of Indigenous children and young people in law and policy making. The first element is to adopt a child rights-based approach using international law as the basis when making laws or policies that will impact children and young people. And to do this with children in a collaborative, culturally appropriate way that upholds their right to self-determination and agency as children. The second element involves seeking ethical review, including governments, not only researchers doing this, and consulting with Aboriginal communities in appropriate ways before engaging or entering Aboriginal communities. The third element involves undertaking preparatory activities with children and young people to get to know them before formally engaging them in participatory processes, such as spending time in their settings, in their schools, at their youth clubs, at their communities, of course, with permission. And in doing so, seeking free, prior and informed consent in child-friendly ways. The fourth element is the actual consultations. And often this is the step that people jump straight to without doing the first 3 steps. This element calls for using child-friendly mechanisms, not adultist mechanisms, to seek young people's views. To do this through play, through technology, such as iPads or photography or video recording. It uses informal, non-intimidating discussion processes, such as Dawn Besserab's yarning method. And the fifth element is vital, and it's about ensuring the participation process benefits young people involved in their community, and that young people are acknowledged and appropriately rewarded for being involved. So essentially, this model is about involving Indigenous children and young people, or any children and young people, in consultation processes about law and policy by using international law as the basis for these consultations. How does this look? It looks like this. These are some photographs from some research that I have done with young Aboriginal people to respectfully seek Aboriginal children and young people's views by using play-based tools such as Magnetex or Play-Doh or anything that is age appropriate to establish a relationship with children and young people by using these tools to understand young people's worldviews and to understand their perspectives and to get to know the young people that you'll be talking with. And to use the child's environment, to not invite children to environments that might make them feel threatened or to be, that might be overly formal. So using young people's spaces. And this mitigates cross-cultural research barriers or consultation barriers by using the culturally appropriate methods. And of course, to make sure you consult with and seek permission from the community before holding such consultations. And to use child and youth friendly methods such as technology or other play-based tools. And to negotiate reciprocity arrangements. And this is very important. For so long, research has not acknowledged particularly Aboriginal people's contributions, and there's been no reciprocity arrangements. So guided by the IATSIS guidelines, this is a really important factor in engaging young people in consultation processes. And of course, make it fun. As a former children's play therapist in my days as a social worker, this needs to be a fun process. And there's no reason why we can't make research and consultation fun. If we don't, then children and young people won't want to participate. And making it fun also breaks down that adult-child power barrier to some degree. And people have written about this, including Barker and Weller. So thank you so much for listening. And at the end, I invite any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Holly. Making it fun. I think so often we adults, researchers, practitioners, academics, others, we forget that important lesson. I'm really looking forward to the questions from the floor and to ask you about your experiences in engaging with children and young people in law and policy development, particularly around the SDGs, the convention, and likewise to our guests here today. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat. We'll move on now to our next presenter, I'd like to introduce Professor Claire Fenton-Glynn. Claire is Director of Cambridge Family Law in the Law School at Cambridge University. Her research lies in the field of children's rights, comparative law, and international human rights law. Claire has published on a wide range of issues, including parenthood, and especially in the field of international surrogacy, child trafficking, and gender identity. Claire's many published works include an edited collection that link children's rights to the Sustainable Development Goals, very relevant to our topic here today. I'd like to introduce Professor Claire Fenton-Glynn.
Hi, everyone, and I have to apologise for the discreet yawning, or I hope was discreet yawning throughout other people's presentations. Holly's was obviously absolutely amazing, but it is also 7 a.m. here, so I'm still waking up my brain as well as my body. Thank you so much for having me here today. What I'm going to talk about is a bit more of a general level than what Holly was doing. I want to talk about child rights budgeting, and in particular, the ways in which the UN has articulated this, the kind of guidelines that they have put in place. This comes from 2 reports that I wrote on behalf of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to the Human Rights Council on investment in children, and also drawing on the general comment from the UN CRC also. So, of course, when we first think about implementing child rights, we are going to think of legislation, we think of policies, we think of programs we use to implement them. But these laws, policies, programs simply cannot be realized without the financial resources that are both effective, efficient, and distributable in an equitable way. So research shows that investment in children does accrue considerable returns. It generates short-term positive benefits as well as cumulative long-term gains. It benefits not only the individuals themselves, but also society and economy at large. So the UN Secretary General has highlighted that equitable, continuous and broad-based investment in children can level the playing field by providing every child with the same opportunities for survival and development. And this really goes to what Holly was saying about the call for non-discrimination in Australia, and in particular, those different social groups. Inadequate investment in children, especially in the most vulnerable and marginalised, can perpetuate intergenerational transmission of poverty, of inequality, leading to irreversible negative impacts on children's development. So, for example, improving equity and health outcomes has been found to contribute directly to economic growth. Investment in preschool enrolment not only benefits the individual children, for example, in terms of higher future wages, but has public benefits in terms of enhanced welfare, crime savings, tax revenues. Investment in quality, equitable education benefits individuals, communities, and countries. So it improves nutrition, reduces child, early and forced marriage. It leads to more equal, respectful, and open societies. So we can see some real profits coming through from investment in children. But regardless of how profitable these returns are, that is kind of by the wayside. Investment in children must be viewed through the lens of a child rights focus, rather than driven by any development benefit. The goal must be investment in the rights of children, in addition to investment in children. So there's an important distinction there between just investment in children themselves and investing in children's rights. So the UN General Assembly emphasised in its report, A World Fit for Children, investing in the rights of children lays the foundation for a just society, a strong economy, and a world free of poverty. So there are 2 basic sides to investment in children. First, how resources are collected, and secondly, how they are distributed. So in terms of resource collection, the committee has made clear that states must take concrete measures to mobilise domestic resources in order to realise children's rights under the CRC fully. So we know that there are civil and political rights which have immediate implementation, and social, economic and cultural rights which are subject to a more progressive realisation. But the committee makes clear that even with progressive realization, you can't just sit back and say, oh, we don't have enough resources. It is the responsibility of the state to make those resources available, to ensure that they collect enough, for example, from tax, through responsible borrowing, an enabling environment for inclusive national growth and productivity, as well as attracting international investment, international financial and technical cooperation, and assistance in a way that promotes the realization of children's rights. So states are generally aware that taxes are the largest, most sustainable and most predictable source of finance for countries at all levels of development. And the importance of effective and efficient taxation can be seen in the results of a study examining the connection between tax revenues and progress on the Millennium Development Goals, that is, the goals that were in place before the Sustainable Development Goals came into place in 2015. So the study concluded that where tax to GDP ratio is high and tax revenues add incremental progress in identifiable obligations, fewer children are undernourished, more people will be able to read, and the child mortality rate will be lower and fewer women will die in labour. So we can see that there's a real benefit from ensuring that the collection of resources to ensure that they are coming in from a variety of places, but also so that they are thought about in a sustainable way that will be good for both the short-term and the long-term implementation. When turning to resource allocation, the UN Committee has stressed the vital importance of the effectiveness, the efficiency and the equity of public spending to achieve child rights. And this can be divided into 3 stages: budget preparation, budget enactment, and budget execution and accountability. So if we look at budget preparation and formulation, we know that in preparing a budget, it's important to remember that economic policies are never neutral in their effect on children's rights. States are in a better position to effectively budget for children if they embed measures to ensure that their best interests within mainstream budget cycles and other fiscal processes. So this is making sure that there is an explicit line for children's rights, that everything is clearly articulated. And systematic child rights impact assessments, or CRIAs, can help translate this principle into practice. So they assess how social and economic policies, resource mobilization, budget spending, and other fiscal processes impact children and the realization of their rights. So using CRIAs at different places throughout the process can ensure that children are represented, that children's rights are not forgotten at every stage. So the second stage is budget enactment and allocation of resources. So when enacting the budget, the committee makes clear that states must ensure the achievement of child's rights is a primary consideration and that children are prioritised in resource allocation. And in doing so, what is recommended is that there is a detailed budget which helps differentiate helps different stakeholders see how much the government is allocating to particular budget line items that directly impact on children. So this is not just education, health, child protection, the general ones we think about, but also civil registration, vital statistics, a running of child rights infrastructure, for example, children's ombudspersons. No government can claim to be fulfilling children's rights to the maximum extent of available resources unless it can clearly identify the proportion of the budget that is allocated to children, both directly and indirectly. So the final stage is the one that we actually usually think about when you talk about budgeting for children. You usually think about the endpoint, the spending. The child-sensitive budget planning, monitoring and expenditure tracking is important to allow for an assessment of whether the amounts allocated are actually used for their intended purpose. So a robust budget classification system, which allows the tracking of spending along administrative, economic, functional and programmatic lines, is important. And throughout all these stages, one thing that remains vital is the involvement of children. So in 2014, Save the Children undertook consultations with children on their views on investment in children. Involvement in the budgeting process was a key issue of concern for the majority of children, who explained that they were well positioned to advise governments because they understood the impact of that spending on their lives. So they argued that all levels of government, including local, regional and national, should include the views of children from diverse ages and background in their decision making. So the right to children to participation should be enshrined in law and occur throughout the entire budget process within all parts of government. So participation in budget setting, in spending, in monitoring has to be meaningful, ensuring that they're consulted and informed throughout the entire budget process, and their voices are heard and taken into account on an equal basis with adults. And the committee says that this should be formalised at all levels, as I said, from national to regional to community. And very much chiming in with what Holly has said, these need to be child friendly, these need to be age appropriate, safe process and mechanisms where children can articulate their views and recommendations. They need that facilitators to ensure that children are not coerced and not manipulated, but give their views voluntarily, and that consultations are conducted at a time and location that is appropriate for them. So the participation of children requires that the entire budget process be open, transparent, accountable, that adequate information be provided in a child-friendly manner. So we need that fiscal and policy information is often given at a high level. So often it's in language that even adults don't understand when they sit through and have to sort through it. So we need to make sure that this is translated into an understandable format, that it's sufficiently disaggregated to enable children and other stakeholders to identify and track budget lines easily. So this has been a really quick kind of overview of budgeting for children, but the message, I hope, is that a lack of sufficient, effective, inclusive and efficient public spending on children is one of the biggest barriers to the realisation of children's rights. Child rights policy, child rights legislation, programmatic commitments remain empty promises unless the government generates and equitably allocates adequate resources for their implementation in the local, in the national budgets, and ensure the effective and efficient use of their resources. Unless we have this, children's rights will, simply continue to be tokenistic. They will continue to be just words on paper without the budget to back them up. It is just an empty promise. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. I think you, in light of our recent budget announcements in Australia, I think we can safely say that that's so very true. The idea that without financial backing, we are looking perhaps at rhetoric and empty promises. I'd be very keen to explore the issues around children's participation in budgeting through questions. So please, everyone, feel free to put your hand up, and we have questions in the chat, and I'll take us to the first question, which was for Holly, and this is a question from Meta Cousins. Thanks, Meta. This is a question for Holly. The participation model you are suggesting is looking quite institutionalised. How do you see this working in Australia? What government level, local, statutory, state, Commonwealth, should it be located at? How would you ensure that child participation occurs consistently rather than on an ad hoc basis?
Thank you, Matthew. Hello, Meta, and thank you for your question. I think it's a very valid question, and the model indeed is actually designed around institutional responses to young people's engagement in public decision making. So it is very much an institutional model. not one that is not relevant to settings where it isn't engaging with children in an institutional setting. And by institutional, I mean government departments, attorneys general, departments of child protection, many different agencies that should be seeking children and young people's views, particularly Aboriginal children and young people's views. So it's unapologetically aimed at institutional use, and I think it's particularly useful for that. And indeed, the young people who helped formulate this model were asked about that kind of methodology for engaging children and young people in public decision making, so about law and about policy. So it's not directed at private decision making, and I think it's relevant across all levels of government. They're not steps. I know it seems as though it's sequential, but they're not steps. In order to undertake element 2, it's the addressing ethical issues. Element 1 also has to be undertaken in terms of adopting a rights-based approach. Similarly, element 5, ensuring benefit and reciprocity. That's not the end point. This must be something that's negotiated throughout and contemplated throughout the consultation process. In terms of consistent application, I think this is very difficult, and that's actually about government buy-in and political will to have young people's participation in public decision making. And that's something that as researchers and as advocates we can keep pushing for, but ultimately we need political will to implement the Convention on the Rights of the Child, particularly Article 12 of that. So if there is government will to do so, I think that models such as this, and there are others, could be very helpful in setting out a template for how to go about that.
Thank you, Holly. A part of Meta's question 2 was about how, at what level of government, or what would it actually look like? And I guess I'd like to frame as a provocation, and if we could envisage such a, or can you envisage your model being used alongside or within a proposed voice to Parliament as a means by which, one, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children's voices are heard in amongst adult discussions that are more, very likely to take place in that area, and equally, if they can be somehow involved in a voice to Parliament, whether that might also feed into the budgeting process and provide a means of participation such as that Claire envisaged. And then I'd also like to hear from Claire about that idea and the interrelationship. So yes, sorry, I'm framing it around the voice to Parliament and the relationship of your model to the hoped for voice.
Thank you, Matthew. And you've preempted a body of publications that my colleague Bayemi Williamson from ANU and I are soon to publish with respect to treaty research that we conducted with young Aboriginal people in Victoria around the First Peoples Assembly there, and some radical things that are happening there with respect to voice. And also with respect to the enfranchisement of 16 and 17-year-old young Aboriginal people to form that assembly. This is the first time in Australia's history that any young people have been enfranchised to vote in a significant state election. We've done some research on young people's views about treaty and young Aboriginal people's views about treaty, what they want included in treaty. And most people said they want their voices included in treaty negotiations and in any treaty or treaties that arise out of that process of agreement making. I think that having a model that says that children's and young people's voices are vital for forming a new way of recognising Indigenous people's sovereignty and position as First Nations peoples has to involve the voice of young people. It's the largest demographic in the Aboriginal population. And without that voice of young people, it's not a fulsome voice. And so that's the research that we have done and will be publishing soon to advocate for the inclusion of young Aboriginal people in treaty negotiations, not just at the state level, but at the national level. And that's already happening in Victoria, which is very exciting. And I'll leave the question about budgeting to you, Claire.
Thanks so much, Holly. That is incredibly exciting research, and I'm sure we're all very keen to see as the voice and referendum progresses and as your research and the models develop. Claire, for you, in relation to the notion of the voice to Parliament, perhaps internationally you've seen other Indigenous parliaments, such as the Sami parliaments, or other examples where children's voices are heard and children's rights analysis has had an input into budgeting. Can you speak to those issues for us, Claire?
So there are, as you've said, there are various examples of ways in which you can include children in budgeting, both directly and indirectly. So as you said, there can be a direct voice to Parliament where children are coming directly to the national decision makers, but there are also kind of devolved indirect processes that it doesn't just have to be that one individual voice. It can be a wider consultation. We see this going on in a number of countries where there's, for example, building the capacity of children at a local level to be able to discuss local budgeting, to ensure that there are those different levels of participation, because I think it's, it is an absolutely wonderful thing, and obviously a step that not many countries have taken, to get that high level participation of going straight to government. But that is kind of the headline. It's the very, a very basic necessity, but we need more, and we need to ensure that it's coming through at various levels and on a wider basis, because we know that even in those kind of child parliaments, this is a very privileged group of people who end up being part of these parliaments. It ends up being the ones with the greater resources who are able to participate in them. And so it's important that we have other mechanisms as well to ensure that there is a wider participation.
Thanks, Claire. It sounds incredibly exciting about the potential that's been identified here, and Holly's work to bring Indigenous children's voices to the Australian voice to Parliament and potentially into budget processes. I have a question for you, Claire, from Melissa from Zimbabwe. How will you ensure that there is equitable distribution of resources in budgeting in issues to do with children at the national level, as you said that they remain empty promises? How are you aiming to solve this? We are facing the same situation in Zimbabwe.
So I think the first and most important step is transparency. That until the budget has these differentiated budget lines, until it shows clearly what resources are allocated for children, then there's absolutely nothing we can do, because we don't know what's going on. We can't even take a baseline assessment of, are we budgeting for children, because we don't know what the budget is. So a really good example of this is Peru, which took a life cycle approach used in the analysis of federal budget allocations to children's rights. So the purpose of this was they quantified specific public investment in 3 basic stages of childhood. So early childhood, 0 to 5 years, children 6 to 12, and adolescent 13 to 17. And so they clearly set out what budgets would be used to benefit each group of children as part of their whole budgeting system. So you can also see some examples. India, South Africa, Zambia have started to use performance-based and program-based budgeting. So you can track child-focused budget allocations and expenditure. So my first piece of advice would absolutely be ensuring transparency, ensuring that there are separate budget lines, because without that, we can't even take the next step.
Thank you, Claire. I have another question for you from James. In Australia, there is often a discourse about budgets for families, barely ever for children. Is this adequate? If not, any suggestions for connecting the two positions?
In a word, no. I mean, yes, I work in the area of family law a lot, but with children's rights within that. And one of the biggest barriers to children's rights can be the family, that children are still seen in this antiquated way as part of the family unit rather than individuals in their own right. And so the family creates a kind of bubble that insulates children from the government and from, you know, individualized rights. So it's actually, you know, you have to break through that family bubble and see the children in and of themselves. So I think budgeting for families, obviously important, yes. Sufficient to talk about children's rights? Absolutely not. Sorry, I hope you'll forgive my bluntness. Yes, I am coming from the UK, but as you can hear from my accent, I am an Australian originally. So, you know, Australia, it's close to my heart, and it pains me when Australia doesn't do well. But I think that there has to be an individualized look at children and their rights. If they're subsumed within the family, they are not being seen. And it's as simple as that.
Thank you very much, Claire. A question for Holly. In recent times, Holly, the literature and research around children's participation, I think a lot of, and when we've had Laura Lundy in our webinar series, I'd be interested to hear how your model and what's become known as the Lundy model maybe talk to each other or have similarities or differences.
Interesting that you asked, Matthew, because Lundy's model is the basis of mine. And I used her model as well as applied a decolonizing model using Martin Nakata's standpoint theory and relating that to children. And so I combined Laura's model, which didn't incorporate considerations around Indigenous children, with Indigenous scholarship, and created a new way of thinking about children's participation using Lundy as well as a range of Indigenous scholars, so thereby blending that kind of legal model with Indigenous scholarship.
And have you found, I think the book's relatively recent, but have you found an international audience amongst other Indigenous populations for these concepts and broad approval for your model?
Well, I don't know whether I could claim to have broad approval for the model. It was part of a PhD project that was done individually, which comes with its own constraints and limitations. So now I am part of a very large research team looking at children's participation across 5 continents that is led by Associate Professor Tara Collins in Canada. And we're doing a piece of work at the moment around decolonizing children's participation. And we're looking a lot at Indigenous scholarship around that, which is emerging at the moment. So we're very excited to be a part of that and to be working in collaboration and seeking advice from other thinkers in this space.
Marvelous stuff. Thank you so much. There's a question for Claire to follow on from Melissa's question. Do you have examples where governments have used the process you outlined? So I think you mentioned Peru, Claire, but I'd also be interested to know, in addition to that, in discussions you're aware of with decision makers, politicians, and the like, what is it that gets them across the line on the issue of children's budgeting? What have you found works to overcome whatever barriers exist to embracing this concept?
I have to admit that's a bit further than my expertise because I haven't worked on the ground with this. What I will say is that organisations like Save the Children, things like having an individual child rights commissioner or ombudsperson, having someone there who is outside the government who's really pushing it through, who is doing the research to show the government why this is a benefit for them. Unfortunately, you know, governments aren't always convinced because it's their right. you need the, well, it's good for you too argument coming through. And that is what, Save the Children had done a lot of. For example, the UK commissioner, the Children's Commissioner, did some research to show how the impact of tax credit, welfare benefits implemented, and how this impacted, so it's got that outside impetus. So that is something that we see consistency through. In the 2 reports I wrote, you do have examples of good practice. In every Human Rights Council report, you do have to put in, well, here's some places where it's going on well. So if people are interested, they can see what was going on. But there's no country that does it exceptionally. There's countries that do a bit well here and a bit well there, or have implemented a part of this. They have some participation, but they don't have the transparency, or they have the transparency, but not the participation. So, it is still very much a work in progress.
Thank you, Claire. Ladies and gentlemen, we're coming close to the time at which we close. We do aim to practice or close at 6 o'clock sharp. So please, any further questions in the chat, or please do feel free to put up your hand. My next question's for Holly. Holly and Claire just mentioned the Children's Commissioners. And of course, internationally and even perhaps domestically, there are different functions and different roles, and some might even say very different sort of outcomes that those officers give rise to. Have you seen good practice in Australia amongst the Children's Commissioners in terms of their engagement with Indigenous youth, and specifically around their participation rights?
Yeah, but to tell you the truth, I wouldn't claim to know all there is to know about National Children's Commissioners' engagement with Aboriginal young people in this country. I believe that there has been a significant degree of consultation with Aboriginal communities, and that was done in the context of community work. And I think that that's quite appropriate for governments to do consultations in that way. And I've read a fair bit of the work and witnessed a fair bit of the work that Megan did as the first National Children's Commissioner, and learning more and more about our current National Children's Commissioner's work, Anne Holland's, through the Child Rights Task Force that I'm a part of, and other people on this call are also a part of. So I think that there is still a lot of scope to do this work, but I think that it's really important that Aboriginal people lead that work, and that Children's Commissioners work alongside indeed other commissioners such as June Oscar or other Indigenous peoples to do that work. I think for so long non-Indigenous people have led that work, and I don't think that's appropriate anymore for that to take place. We need to be really respecting Aboriginal people's right to self-determine, and that's stipulated across various instruments at international law. And I think that there is a lot of great work going on, but I think there's a lot of scope for the voices of Indigenous children to shine through more, and that we can be doing that in a systematic way, to go back to what Meta mentioned before, and how to do this in a systematic, consistent way rather than in an ad hoc, tokenistic way as such. Not that I'm suggesting the National Children's Commissioners have by any stretch done that, but I think that the overarching message I'd like to convey is that we need to be emphasising Indigenous peoples leading these processes with children and young people. And to do that outside PhD programs and part of large funded research projects that are led by Aboriginal peoples would be ideal.
Thank you, and here. We have a few comments, and which are perfect on which to wrap up our session today, everyone. Framed as a question, but I'll take it as a comment. Sorry, Andre. There is a tendency for child rights commissioners and ombudspersons to focus on a social work basis than a rights basis. I think that can definitely be said at times, and of course we would want all our children's commissioners to be taking the children's rights-based approach. A marvellous comment from Mithin. Thank you, Mithin. I'd like to thank the DTP and Youth Law Australia for arranging such a meaningful seminar on children's rights. Heart, back at you, Mithin. And also Melissa. I'd like to thank you all for your strong commitment towards children and their rights. They are tomorrow's leaders, and so on and so forth. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please thank our presenters today, Holly Doel-Mackaway and Claire Fenton-Glynn. Put your hands together. Thank you very much. That's it for us today, everyone. I would like to thank in passing, of course, as well, DTP, Rataba and Claire, who have been busily posting in the chat references for your information. Please access that. And of course, Claire and Rataba at DTP will be emailing out these links to you tomorrow. I think that's correct, Claire. Great stuff. And of course, I'd like to thank you. You come to our program from all over the world. We have a healthy Australian audience, but we're so proud that this workshop series, this webinar series, reaches all points of the globe. And we want to thank you for joining us today. And thank you especially, Holly and Claire. And thank you, everyone. That's us.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.